A war that lasted 335 years, no shots fired, no one hurt, and almost nobody knew it was happening. This is Quilled history, the stories the textbooks quietly left out. How does a war just vanish? It started in 1651, then everyone moved on. One historian's letter ended it in 1986. Why did the Dutch declare war on a tiny island chain? In 1651, England was in civil war. Royalist privateers from Scilly raided Dutch ships. Dutch losses mounted. They sent 12 warships, but by the time they arrived, the Royalists had already surrendered. So Admiral Tromp declared war on the islands themselves. Then everyone simply forgot. The declaration was never withdrawn. For over 3 centuries, the war just sat there, unremembered. Because no peace treaty was signed, the war technically continued, 1651 to 1986, 335 years, 0 casualties. But here's the twist. The declaration might have been invalid. You can't declare war on a piece of a country. Maybe it was a myth, but the 1986 treaty was real. Belief made it true. Roy Duncan found the claim in 1985. He wrote to the Dutch embassy. They confirmed. The war was still on. The ambassador came. On April 17, 1986, they signed the treaty. The crowd cheered. 335 years after a war, nobody fought. It was officially over. A forgotten quirk got its happy ending. The story shows how a simple oversight can create an absurd reality. So, what were these privateers actually doing? They weren't pirates in the modern sense. They had commissions from the royalist government, making their raids technically legal. Dutch merchants watched their cargo, spices, textiles, silver, disappear into English hands. Insurance rates skyrocketed, and Amsterdam's trading houses felt the pinch. The Dutch Republic, a maritime superpower, couldn't ignore these attacks. They demanded compensation, but the royalists, busy fighting a civil war, simply ignored them. That refusal set the stage for Tromp's drastic action, turning a commercial dispute into a formal declaration of war. But Tromp's decision wasn't just about revenge. He had a reputation to uphold. As one of the Netherlands' greatest admirals, he couldn't let Dutch honor be insulted. Yet, declaring war on a group of islands, not a nation, was unprecedented. He probably thought it would be a quick, symbolic gesture. After all, the islands were small, with few defenders. He likely expected a swift surrender or a negotiated settlement. Instead, he got silence. The royalists had already surrendered to Parliament, so there was no one to respond. Tromp sailed away, and the declaration was filed away and forgotten. The declaration was made, but why did it disappear? In the chaos of the English Civil War, records were scattered. The Dutch had more pressing matters, wars with Spain and England. The islands changed hands, and nobody thought to check if a war was still on. For centuries, the declaration sat in archives, gathering dust. It wasn't until the 20th century that historians began to piece together the story. But even then, it was seen as a curiosity, not a real conflict. The war was a ghost, existing only on paper, waiting to be rediscovered. Part of the reason the war was forgotten was the island's isolation. The Isles of Scilly sit about 28 miles off Cornwall's coast. Even today, they're a quiet, remote place with a few thousand residents. In the 17th century, they were even more cut off. Communication was slow, and news traveled by ship. After the Civil War, the islands became a backwater. No one in London or The Hague thought about them. So the war, declared on a tiny archipelago, simply slipped out of collective memory. It was a footnote in history, buried under more pressing events. But when historians did rediscover the war, they argued about its validity. International law requires a declaration of war to be made by a sovereign state. The Dutch Republic was a state, but the Isles of Scilly were not. They were part of England. So, could Tromp legally declare war on them? Many say no. The war was a diplomatic fiction. Yet, the Dutch government never formally retracted the declaration. So, in a technical sense, the state of war persisted. This legal gray area is what makes the story so fascinating. It's a war that exists only because no one bothered to end it. A war that was never legal still mattered. It's a powerful symbol of how history is made. The 335 years war isn't about battles or treaties. It's about the stories we tell. It shows how a simple oversight can create an absurd reality. And it reminds us that history isn't just facts. Its interpretation: the war became real because people believed it was. That belief, in turn, shaped the 1986 ceremony. So, even if the war was a myth, it had real consequences. It brought two nations together in a moment of shared humor and reconciliation. That brings us to Roy Duncan. He wasn't a professional historian by training, but he had a passion for local history. As chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, he was well versed in the island's past. One day, while researching, he stumbled upon a reference to the 335-year war. Intrigued, he dug deeper. He found that no peace treaty had ever been signed. Duncan realized this could be a unique opportunity, a chance to end a war that had been forgotten for centuries. So, he decided to write a letter, not expecting much, but hoping for a response. So Duncan wrote to the Dutch embassy in London. He asked, almost jokingly, if the war was still on. To his surprise, the embassy took him seriously. They checked their records and found no peace treaty. They replied, confirming that, technically, the war was still ongoing. This was a bombshell. The Dutch government, known for its meticulous record-keeping, had no record of ending the war. So, they decided to do something about it. They agreed to send an ambassador to sign a peace treaty. Duncan's letter had set in motion a diplomatic event that would capture the world's attention. But planning the ceremony wasn't without its challenges. The Dutch ambassador, Rijn Huydekoper, had to travel to the remote islands. They needed to decide on a date and a format. Should it be a formal state ceremony or a lighthearted event? They chose April 17th, 1986, a date that would be easy to remember. The ceremony would take place on St. Mary's, the largest island. They invited locals and the press. The ambassador prepared a speech and Duncan prepared a response. Everyone knew it was a bit absurd, but they embraced the humor. It was a chance to celebrate a quirk of history. On April 17th, 1986, the day arrived. The sun shone over St. Mary's as the ambassador stepped ashore. A crowd gathered, including schoolchildren and veterans. The ceremony was short but meaningful. Huydekoper and Duncan signed the treaty, officially ending the war. The ambassador made a joke about hoping the peace would last. Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a moment of pure joy. A war that had never been fought was finally over. The world's media covered the story, and the islands became famous overnight. It was a reminder that even the strangest things can be resolved with a little humor. The story quickly went global. Newspapers and TV stations picked it up. People were amazed that a war could last so long without anyone noticing. The humor of the situation appealed to many. It was a feel-good story in a world often dominated by conflict. The islands received a flood of attention, and tourism spiked. The Dutch and British governments used it as a symbol of their friendly relations. The 335 Years' War became a lesson in how diplomacy can be playful. It showed that even the most absurd situations can be resolved with goodwill and a sense of humor. The war may never have legally existed, but the ceremony was real. History is full of forgotten quirks, waiting for a curious letter. One forgotten story every week. Subscribe and catch the real pirate code of the Caribbean.